So I hope you all had an enjoyable lunchtime listening to Rachel Reeves' seminar, distracted by a penny off the pint of beer, which I might enjoy tonight at the Tottenham game when I watch, hopefully, Tottenham beat Man City. That is my plan for this evening. But before we do that, I want to welcome some of our guests today on our very special edition of this Chai Time. Half an hour, 45 minutes of some quick fire questions, really around innovation, entrepreneurship, EIS, SEIS, tax efficient investing, and everything else that affects our ecosystem and our businesses. So I've got really glad that we've got this really actually fantastic panel today. So I'll start with Colin. Colin, do you want to just introduce yourself?
Yes, so Colin Haley, tax advisor and chair of the Finance and Tax Advisory Committee at the UK BioIndustry Association. Just by way of caveat, any views on this call are mine, not those of the BioIndustry Association.
Thank you, Colin. Alice?
Yeah, so Alice McGowan, I'm Chief Executive of Nottingham Technology Ventures. So we're the subsidiary of University of Nottingham that manages spin-out activity, and same caveat, views here are mine and not University of Nottingham's.
Thanks, Alice. And Stephen?
Hi, I'm the founder of a financial planning practice based in the Midlands and London, and also wearing a different hat, I'm the main board director of ESA.
Thank you for that. So yeah, those who don't know me, I think probably most people will do, but just in case, so my name's Sunil. I sort of lead the O2h Ventures, EIS, knowledge intensive and SEIS funds along with my colleagues. And we invest into biotechs. We have about 35 investments or so that we've made over the last few years. And we have 2 open funds. So that's just a quick snippet on us, but we also have other units and businesses as part of our ecosystem and our businesses, including a service business called o2h Discovery. And we have an incubator where I'm sitting in this lovely grade 2 listed building in Cambridge, in central Cambridge, where we incubate startups. So I've got a whole list of things here that I really am dying to sort of delve into. But before I sort of go into those areas, Colin, as our tax expert, maybe you can just give a summary of what you've heard today.
Yeah, thank you. So I think from my point of view, this was a budget where the intention was raise more money, but don't change anyone's behaviour. So effectively, a lot of changes on capital gains tax rates, they're all going up, but basically, they're going up, but not by so much as to change everyone's behaviour, as in they remain significantly lower than income tax rates. On EIS and SEIS, no changes at all, and then all the other things that are important to sort of investee companies of EIS funds, so R&D tax credits, EMI share option schemes, those kind of things are unaffected. And then if you look at the spending side of it, a lot of announcements on increases to R&D budgets, a lot more money, and the government's looking at sort of 8 priority sectors, of which life sciences is one. The government clearly putting a lot of value on life sciences and technology and not wanting to damage that in any way, while at the same time needing to raise a lot of money.
So do you think overall it was kind of a balanced budget that achieved those goals? What are your thoughts on that? Do you think it would achieve the growth that it sets out to do? And how do you think the market respond to the budget as well, given that they have changed the way that they calculate borrowing? Do you think that's something that markets will be wary of? I have seen them, they sort of went up at first and then it sort of started a steady decline and gilts have spiked somewhat. So I don't know if that's something that will continue.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of spending talk because there's a big assumption that we're going to collect a lot of tax. Now, if given the change in national insurance, you get less people coming on as employees, or you get changes in terms of non-dom taxation. So non-domicile rules are being swept away. If non-dom people leave the country, where does that leave us? Will the government then be able to collect that tax in order to fund all the promises it's now making? So I think, obviously, I hope it all works out for them, but there's some very big assumptions in there about tax collection to fund the spending commitments.
So we're going to delve into a few of the key points first, and then we'll come out again and sort of look overarching for the UK economy and the innovative ecosystem as well. But the first point I'm going to sort of delve into is IHT and AIM. And Stephen is someone who is an expert in this area. So, I mean, what I understood of that very quickly was that she sort of said it under her breath somewhat, that they were going to increase IHT from 0 to 20% for AIM listed stocks. But on the back of that, I think there was a bit of a relief, because I did say the AIM market rally after that, because I think, you know, in typical Chancellor fashion, they kind of give you the worst news before, and then it's not quite as bad as you thought, and then you sort of have a relief rally. Is that what happened? Did I get that right, or did I completely read that?
You've summarized it rather well, actually. Doesn't leave me a great deal to add. What I would say is that the AIM market was worried. Because although it is a stock market investment, and therefore we all know you should only invest for good, solid, sound investment reasons, there's absolutely no doubt that the inheritance tax relief after the qualifying period was definitely attractive for very, very many people. And speaking as a planner, it was something that we used because of the relief that was available, particularly for elderly clients who still wanted to sort of mitigate inheritance tax quite later on in life. Now, that's still there. So it's still not going to lose its planning opportunities. It's simply not quite as attractive if your motivation was purely inheritance tax planning. But again, speaking as a planner, it should never have been just that, or it's actually a minority of people who do it just for that. But yeah, 20% tax as opposed to nil tax after the qualifying.
Yeah, I mean, my mother invests into the AIM markets in general for really that reason. And, you know, they've underperformed my other parts of her portfolio, let's just say. So I think if it wasn't for that, she might pull it. But yeah, so I'm glad that they've kept it there.
Sorry to interrupt, but I was going to say, to be fair, the AIM market, if you looked at it as an indices, depending on which timescale you want, go from as being okay short term to truly dreadful over the longer term. So if you invested sort of 5+ years ago, you really aren't going to be very happy. But having said that, without being specific, there are some fund managers who specialize in that particular space who've demonstrated that actually if there's any market or any indices that demonstrates the value of stock picking, it's that one. There have been some good results.
Yeah, I think that's where she may have gone wrong. So my bad advice. Maybe she should come to you. So the next area I just want to delve into a little bit with this colossal 20 billion that's been allocated to R&D funding. I don't know what the number was earlier, but it seems like a large number to me. And that is going into things like accelerators, into some core funding for universities. I presume that was already there anyway. I saw this Glasgow and West Midlands incubators. I presume some of that will go into Innovate UK. So I think firstly, on to Alice, I mean, how much of that funding do you think is going to come into Nottingham, or do you have an accelerator that might receive some of that? And how important do you think that funding is for some of your spin-outs?
Well, so I think the overall picture of the funding and the increase in funding that we've seen for science and technology is really positive. You know, I guess where we exist in the spin-out space, we're sort of hit by both ends of the discussion that we're talking about today. So the science and technology research budget, plus also the impacts of the VC market and SEIS investors who are then funding our companies. So I think it was really interesting to see how this played out today. In Nottingham, you know, we have various initiatives. There is going to be, as you say, funding specifically into accelerators and other areas. So waiting to see how this may pan out for Nottingham in particular. But I think overall, quite a positive picture in terms of that R&D budget that's available.
Yeah. And so maybe to Colin, I mean, I know that you're campaigning quite hard for some of these and lobbying hard on behalf of the BIA or things like R&D tax credits. Do you see a lot of the things that you were lobbying for on behalf of the BIA coming to fruition? Like, for example, R&D tax credits is one specific example.
I think on R&D, you know, we've had huge amounts of change and churn over the last sort of 4 or 5 years in that space. Thankfully, this government sort of left it alone, though they have produced what's called a corporate tax roadmap, which says they're going to keep looking at it in terms of various bits of how HMRC operate, maybe reinvigorating the old advanced assurance or advanced clearance system to help people on their first-time claimants, that kind of thing. So they're trying to streamline the process, and they've left open the door to sort of tightening things or reforming things in the future. But right now, there's no change in the rules as a result of today's budget. So I think that's good. I think from a wider BIA perspective, there's always lobbying to say, let's make sure that R&D budgets within government are topped up. And I think it's all good news on that. So on the assumption that the government can collect the tax it thinks, then that's all good. But I was on a call with the Treasury this afternoon, and there was some pushing on, well, what does this mean for the budget at Innovate UK and things like that? And what's very clear, you have to realise how government works. So each individual department gets their what's called a settlement from the Treasury. So that's the pot of money, for example, for the Department of Health. They then, the Minister of the Department of Health, then decides exactly how they spend it. So you've got some spending talked about in the Chancellor's speech where it's directly, we are funding this pot right now and we know where it's going to go. Other bits where it's going to a department and that department then decides how they spend it. So there's kind of a bit to wind through the system yet in terms of how the money trickles down through the government machine.
Oh,
Sunil,
Sunil.
muted.
I think.
So things like Innovate UK have been really important to some of the soft money that helps some of these companies start, especially at the early stage. Things like EIS and SEIS as well have been like critical to getting these companies started. Do you have any feeling of the allocation of the funding that will support some of those sort of softer ways of funding these startups?
I think that the general mood music, I think, is that the amount of funding is not going to go down. It'll either be maintained or it will increase. That's where we are today. That's certainly the intention. Whether that can be maintained over the long term, we'll see. But right now, I think the government's very keen to send this message. Look, we've earmarked these as sort of industries of the future, high priority areas. We want to maintain, if not increase, funding in those areas. So it's, as we sit here now, it's all good.
So just quickly over to Stephen. So, when your clients come to you and they would like to invest some money, what kind of tax efficient products do you think are likely to be higher on their agenda, and how do you think this budget might affect that?
Well, I still think that BR related products using AIM are going to remain as one of the tools. But obviously the big two that we use a great deal of are, well, technically three, are seed, EIS and VCTs. We all know, of course, that VCTs are very attractive for their income being totally tax-free, the dividend stream. But they've been unaffected, the tax treatment for those three vehicles. So I actually don't see demand diminishing at all. And if anything, I think demand is going to increase because BR is going to be slightly less attractive. EIS and Seed have got the reassurance of knowing there's going to be no adverse tax changes there at all. But of course, the really important announcement regarding the latter two wasn't made in the budget. It was made a month or so earlier. And that was, of course, that the sunset clause has been extended for another 10 years. And that was enormously reassuring for very many people who are in the know. So in reality, what we had was a boost in the confidence, an increase in investment opportunities, of interest in the investment opportunities. And now I heard that there was a slight drop just before the budget because people just sort of going, well, it wasn't going to get through in time anyway, so let's wait and see what happens in the budget. But I think there's going to be a big resurgence in demand in those tax advantaged vehicles.
Yeah, no, we've seen over the last few months, we've seen a lot of inquiries and investments going into these tax efficient funds, and I think the stability that announcement, that I think the government did a wise move announcing it as early as possible, because it really would have stifled that whole sector and industry. And there's a lot of funding that goes into these startups through these EIS and SEIS vehicles. So maybe just quick over to Alice. How important do you think things like these EIS funds have been to support some of the startups that come out of your stable at Nottingham?
Yeah, they're hugely important. You've mentioned already the UKRI funding, but the majority of our companies that are pre-revenue are looking to SEIS, EIS investments to get them through those early few years. So I'm really reassured to hear that there could be a resurgence. It's been, I'm sure anybody who's in the startup space knows it's been a tough few years for companies trying to raise funds. So I think any positive movement, in that direction will be great for our portfolio. We've got a number of very early stage companies, and they're high risk. SEIS is very important for investors seeking to mitigate some of the risk in those investments. So,
thanks, Alice. By the way, if you have a question, fire it into the chat, and I'll aim to pass it on to one of our esteemed panelists. There's a little bit I just need to untangle here in terms of this entrepreneurs relief and this business relief, and I think sort of the terms have merged into one. It used to be that you got 10% entrepreneurs relief. So if you're a founder of a company, on the first million, you'd only pay 10% tax. Now they've changed the name of it and changed the terms of it. So maybe Colin, you want to just untangle that for
I get the nerd's tax question, do I? Okay.
Yeah.
So entrepreneurs, I am a tax nerd. Okay. So entrepreneurs relief was renamed a few years ago to business asset disposal relief. I think it was partly political because they thought, well, not just entrepreneurs are claiming it. So it became business asset disposal relief, gave you a 10% rate of capital gains tax if you met certain conditions. Then what's now happened today, they've announced lots of increases in capital gains tax rates. So the basic rate of capital gains tax is going from 10% up to 18%. And then the higher rate is going from 20% up to 24%. So business asset disposal relief, what was called entrepreneurs relief, has to kind of follow that trajectory. You can't sit there at a 10% rate because it's lower than everything else apart from EIS and CDIS. So they then said, okay, and I'm looking at my notes here. So for disposals on or after 6th of April next year, 10% becomes 14%. And then year after that, so for disposals on or after 6th of April 2026, the rate becomes 18%. So you get back to being the same as the lower rate of capital gains tax. So that's on the first £1 million of gain you make over your lifetime. So it is, therefore, the intention is Treasury collects more money, but it's still significantly lower than the rate you would have paid, or lower than rates of income tax. So, for example, and the reason it gets really murky, it's business asset disposal relief they use when you look at EMI share options for employees in companies like the ones that we've been talking about, where Alice has been talking about, where you get that lower rate of capital gains tax on your EMI share options. Your rate over time is going to go up to 18%, not 10%. But if it was get an EMI share option and pay 18%, or get a new unapproved option and pay income tax, which would you rather have? You'd rather pay 18%.
And do you think this sort of these increases in for example, this business relief, do you think it's going to deter entrepreneurs really starting up? Because, you know, having been an entrepreneur myself, I can see Stephen shaking his head, but I'm going to play the devil's advocate just for the fun of it. It's a lot of blood, sweat, and tears to get started. You literally have no money for a number. If you do it properly, old school entrepreneurship, you put everything you've got, you chuck it in. You basically, the first 5 years are horrible in that you have no money and you put a lot into it, and you have to sacrifice a lot of your personal life and commitments to get there, and you just have to engage your whole self. And if you're lucky enough to make it to the other side, and the odds are against you, then you want to be able to win. And so to get through that activation barrier, there has to be enough pull to make it happen. Now, if you're going to have to give away a significant portion of your winnings to the government, then that pull becomes less stronger, and it's hard enough to get people to go through the machinery process already to try and find people who can be really true. I'm not talking about VC-backed entrepreneurs. I'm talking about guys who do it from scratch on their own without the sort of the backing and the funding. Do you think it will make us a less innovative, entrepreneurship-driven economy? Open to the panel.
I'm going to be bullish and say no. I think certainly the entrepreneurs that are creating spin-out companies, that's my area of knowledge. They're in it for more than just the gain. So, it's about developing their science. It's about making a difference and an impact. And yes, there will be an impact on their returns at the end with the increase to 18%. But, as Colin said, it's still better than income tax. And hopefully, we're creating ambition in these businesses, and they will be, reaping the rewards of highly innovative, successful businesses that will sustain that increase for their founders.
I think it's partly could be the sector that we're in, that because we work in biotech, me and Alice, and therefore it's going to have people work for those businesses and try and drive this for more than just money. These businesses do have significant impact, and therefore that has to be weighed into the answer as well. If you're Colin, go on.
I think also, even if you are financially motivated in starting that kind of business, well, if you do really well and you make more than £1 million of gain, well, then you're going to be paying capital gains tax at the new higher rate of 24%. It's still way lower than income tax rates. So I think it's still, it doesn't, as I said at the start, I don't think there's anything here that's going to change behaviour.
Carefully crafted plan to increase one rate, and then sort of the other one will sort of follow it somewhat. So it's like, okay, then it's not as bad as it could have been,
Yeah, exactly. It's still lower than income tax rates, and I think there was a lot of talk, there's an awful lot of press talk about they're going to harmonise capital gains tax and income tax rates. Then there's a realisation from a lot of analysis that showed if you did that, it would be a disincentive to a lot of people. But as long as it's lower and significantly lower, then I think people will carry on starting businesses, either because there's a financial aspect, but it's still worthwhile, or the financial aspect is kind of in the back of their minds, but it's not your primary reason for starting and growing a business.
Well, my glass half. Sorry, Stephen, go on.
No, not at all. I was just going to support Alice's comments, because as a firm, our client bank are mainly entrepreneurs, is the space that we work in, and so our clients cover a much broader sector than simply biotech and things like that. And I don't think that the budget today will influence those characters whatsoever. There'll be a lot of discussions about whether there needs to be refinements to plans. But when I think about the personalities and their motivations, this isn't going to impact that. If they want to go and start something, they're going to go out there and start it. I actually think this is well crafted, and I totally agree with Colin's comments. This is not going to change, as he uses the term, behaviours. I think it's still going to get out there. The entrepreneurs are going to do their thing.
So, I mean, with my glass half full hat on and my positive hat on, this sort of understanding of where we are now, and this sort of, Labour government have through all the sort of consultations, they've always talked about stability and, making sure businesses know what's going to happen over the next 3, 5, 7 years. I think businesses need that. Do you think now we've had that budget, that people feel like, okay, and now at least I know where I am, I can plan for my future, for my business future, and then and allow them to sort of start businesses and be innovative and maybe take more risk with their funds, etc. Do you think it's positive from that perspective that we at least now know where we are? And if Rachel reads us to believe that we still have a lower tax rate than all the G7, which I presume she would have done her homework before she stated that.
I would say that certainty only lasts until the next budget. As a planner, we would deal with the facts and the figures that we've got, and you plan with what you know. So if I tackle that a slightly different way, we spent a bit of time before the budget trying to dissuade clients from doing knee-jerk reactions because they were panicking about something that could have been. So no, if you're gonna make decisions, make it in what you know and deal with the consequences of a future event when it happens, rather than speculating.
Thanks for that. One other thing that a big number that I got thrown in there, and I presume this is on the back of COVID and having to have a home gross manufacturing base for our pharmaceutical industry and not be reliant on third-party countries to supply critical drugs, was 520 million for a new innovative manufacturing fund. Does anyone, Colin, do you know anything about that, or Alice?
No, beyond that announcement, I'm afraid I don't know.
Alice, is that something that that you think will be useful or help your companies?
Yeah, I mean, I think it will be useful. We've got a couple of businesses who are in that space and who potentially, obviously I don't know the details. So once further detail is available, it'd be great to see if there are means of accessing that. But I think it's really important that we look to create sort of greater activity on the domestic front in lots of different sectors, that there is a risk that if this investment doesn't come through, as you say, there are overseas, manufacturing facilities that are sort of starting to progress ahead of the UK. And I think it's, you know, it's really important to have investments of that scale to maintain, I guess, not just how competitive the UK is in terms of its economy, but also the readiness that we have in this country for bringing in new technologies as well, and making sure that from a scientific perspective that we are, you know, we've got upskilled workforce and the technical infrastructure to be able to move forward. So I think that's really positive announcement today.
Yeah, no, I agree. I just think it may not be enough money, knowing how much sort of capex is required for some of these sites. It's sort of humongous, and still, you know, they've got these, once you put the money in, they've got to make money, and it's quite hard to make money in these manufacturing businesses in the UK. So hopefully that goes some way towards supporting that area and sector. To some of the other quick points, just because they're interesting, things like stamp duty on second properties. I'm trying to sort of find the lead into innovation, but does that mean that it'd be less of an attractive investment to buy a second and third property, and therefore more likely to invest in a high-risk startup? Stephen?
That's a Colin question.
It's a Colin. So
no, you don't want advice from me on investing in property. You know, I've invested in a farm. It's just out there, and I read with interest about agricultural property relief, but I'm much more able to talk about that.
I presume we'll be below the threshold which they announced, but no, I don't know, Colin. It may or may not be. But yeah, I think
permission to turn it on to housing. We'll see.
Yeah.
We could take that a slightly different way, though. It's being extremely widely reported, and we all know that many people are pulling out of the buy-to-let market and things like that. So we are seeing more cash around, and it needs to find a home. Now, it's too early to say, but it's reasonable to assume that people will be looking for income stream, because people do it for two reasons, don't they? Capital growth and income. So the VCT market's probably going to benefit mainly, I suspect, from that space, because of the advantages they have there from an income perspective. But it's reasonable that an element of that amount of cash that's floating around will find its way into the EIS space. And I think that may have a knock on, going back to your earlier point about knowledge intensive funds, because of some of the funding that's going, and will that springboard into creating a better market for some of those type of funds? You might have a thought on that.
I think the VCT, just to touch on that a little bit, I think it's a very interesting asset class. I think it's quite hard to find deal flow for VCTs, and the VCTs that do exist, I think, are fairly full up. They find it hard to deploy those funds into dividend or revenue generating businesses that pay out a dividend. I've seen VCTs that mix it up a little bit, where they invest into those businesses which are generating a revenue stream, and therefore a dividend on the back of it potentially, mixed up with sort of higher risk non-revenue generating businesses. But as a mix and a balance, it probably makes sense for VCT. I think the biggest problem with those VCTs is being able to invest into enough businesses that can create that that dividend and revenue stream at that stage, where, you know, which meet the VCT criteria. And so on the back of that, if that fills up, and which was already full before, then I think then people say, well, what's next? And then it's things like EIS funds and such like. So I think that could push people towards EIS funds for that reason.
Potentially, but of course, a VCT can invest in a business that exits, and then of course it's merely paying out the exit value as the dividend. So they still have a more degree of flexibility than on the EIS potentially.
Yeah. So I think I've covered most of my points. I don't need to carry. Is there any? So I'm just going to do last quick fire questions to everybody. Really, is what do you think the overall? Do you think that this will achieve the prime objective really of a higher growth Britain, a higher growth economy? Do you think that the investments and the carefully calculated budget is going to deliver, you know, what it's aimed to do? So I'll start with Stephen, go to Colin, Alice, and then I'll give my summary.
I thought it was a well-crafted budget. I thought that they balanced it very well so as not to create major change. Although we haven't spoken about it particularly, I think the bringing the pensions into the inheritance tax net is going to be incredibly disappointing for many people. but I don't think that that's going to have an impact in entrepreneurial Britain. It's not going to make any difference in that particular regard. It's just going to be a bigger tax take. As I've already touched on, I think from the entrepreneurial perspective, I think the best that can be said for it is it hasn't damaged the future. All it's done is sort of said, yep, we're not going to try to upset the apple cart. We're going to carry on as we were. You know the types of reliefs that are available. We want you to carry on doing it. So overall, I would have to say I think it's positive for the entrepreneurial outlook.
Thank you. Colin?
Yeah, my concern is that they just can't raise the money they want. They think they're going to raise 25 billion from national insurance changes, 12.7 billion from abolishing non-dom status. If they can't meet that, then you've got to do another budget where it really could get nasty. So that's my concern, that they just can't, because
Did they leave enough headroom in that sort of 70 million extra borrowing that they're allowed? That because there's 40 million, there's 70 of extra headroom. There's a 22 billion hole, so there's a little bit of a gap there. Do you think? I didn't. Did the maths say they would?
I haven't looked at how much sort of contingency or headroom they're built in, but you know, all governments seem to manage to spend everything and a bit more. I'm just concerned that, you know, they're assuming that, you know, this is the last big tax raising budget we need to do, and everything's going to pan out. And if we keep saying growth often enough, growth will happen. That's a lovely theory, but I think the practice might be a lot harder than that.
Yeah, thanks, Colin. Fair. Alice?
Yeah, I mean, I think with a focus on innovation and entrepreneurial activity, and this, you know, I feel quite upbeat about the budget. I think Colin makes a very good point. We have to see, you know, if the amount raised will be sufficient. I think for me, it's not just about the financing. You know, obviously, science and innovation requires more than just the financing. It requires the people. It requires thought and a greater strategy around policy and regulation. So I think it's seeing the budget and how that will deliver for science and technology as one part. And then obviously, you know, we need all the rest of the pieces of the jigsaw to come together to create a, you know, a really strong economy in this area.
Thanks, Alice. Good points. I'm going to summarize on, as a venture capitalist hat on, I think the increase in carried interest for venture capitalists in general, doesn't apply to our fund particularly, is probably the most concerning thing for out of the budget. And I'm just hoping that VCs don't then decide to domicile their funds outside the UK or decide to invest elsewhere. I think it's an increase from 28 to 32, so it's not as bad as it was hoped, but then there's a consultation period, and I'm presuming that it could then go up thereafter and align itself into income tax. And VCs have an option and choice as to where to domicile and invest their funds. And if it's not attractive for them to make money in the UK, then they will leave. There was a time, I think, like a few years back, where you go to London and you can meet some very high net worth individuals, and there's like little underground Mayfair flats, and all these family offices were there. Now, a lot of those they're just not there anymore. So if you're a VC trying to raise a fund, it's a lot harder than it was, I think, a few years back, because a lot of the money has now left the UK. And I think that's probably the biggest concern as from the budget. And on overlaying on top of that, you've got the non-dom status that they're eroding. And I'm just hoping that weighs itself out in terms of, you know, the benefit outweighs the penalization of really that non-dom and taking that whole policy out. If a lot of our ultra high net worth individuals decide that it's not in their interest to declare all their income on their UK tax return because they've only been here 5 years and a lot of their wealth has been made abroad, then they may just leave the country. And that's bad, not having those people hanging around, investing in the economy, investing in property, investing in funds. So that is probably the one area which I think I'm most worried about. So
there is still the talk of pensions, you know, Mansion House Compact and more pension fund money coming into UK equities, in particular, into the higher risk sectors. So potentially, you know, that gap might get filled by a different source.
Yeah, no, that would be great. But and its current legislation, those funds can invest anywhere in the world, and they're not mandated to invest in the UK or UK funds. That could change. And for what I understand, the pension companies actually want that to change, so they can say we had to invest in the UK, and that's why. But as of today, that won't really. I think that's quite broad. But I hope it will have an impact. it definitely will have an impact. Let's hope it sooner rather than later. Stephen, you want to say something? Any final words?
Well, actually, I'm purely speaking personally, I am not a fan of the big pension funds being obligated to invest in the UK. They can do it if they want to do it. I think their raison d'etre is to give the best performance to their clients who invest their retirement money, and therefore that they should not have a stipulation X percentage should be invested in the UK. So sorry, I'm not going to support you on that one.
Well, fair enough, Stephen, and I do get it from that perspective. And I always respect your opinion regarding tax efficient funds. You always say you shouldn't invest into a fund just because the tax makes sure the fund's a good performing fund as well.
Absolutely.
So yeah, that's always been sort of your angle.
That's why I like you guys. Yeah.
Okay, good. Thanks so much for your time. I am now going to get myself on a train to White Hart Lane to watch, hopefully, Tottenham beat Man City, I said earlier, and maybe get a penny off the pint, along the way now that the budget's been announced, a bit of a cheaper draft beer. So I will be on a train to Tottenham. Thank you very much for your time, guys. Really appreciate it. Colin, Stephen, Alice, thank you for your opinions and time, and hopefully we'll see you again soon on one of our future Chai Times. Thank you.
Take care.